Let us pray. Almighty God, send your Holy Spirit to be with us today as we continue to read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest the Gospel according to Matthew. Today, chapter 24, and perhaps chapter 25. We ask your blessing on our families, our friends, our congregation, and on the needs of others. Our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so I'm going to start by picking up where I left off last week, which is, I thought this was neat. I discovered this morning. This is an interactive map of the Temple Mount, and if you Google Temple Mount map, it should pop up as this, and you should be able to get to it.
Wow.
Now, how do I get back to it? Hopefully I can get back to it. Yes. Okay. So I thought this was really cool. It gives you somebody took a drone photo, or a helicopter photo, but and they put the little things. If you click on it, you can see all the red dot. Do you see the red dot that I'm clicking on?
Mm-hmm.
So it gives you, is the pop-up working on your page?
Yes.
So like you can see that's the Kidron Valley down here, right? And this is the cemetery that I was talking about, right? That's built up against the wall. And this is the Golden Gate that there's, that a number of Christians and Jews believe that for the Messiah to come, these gates have to be opened again. Well, there's a cemetery right next to it. So that's not going to happen anytime soon, right? And that's part of the reason the cemetery is there. And then there's a lot of things up there that are nowhere near as old as they claim to be. This is the throne of Solomon, which is clearly not the throne of Solomon. But this is obviously the Dome of the Rock, right? But you get a sense, I think, of how big this place is. The Dome of the Rock is not a small building. It's like 50 yards in each direction. And so this is that giant plaza that is what I've called, several football fields big. But there's a stairway down here, and then there's another large plaza here. And this is Al-Aqsa Mosque. If you ever read the news or see the news and that pops up, this is Al-Aqsa. And the mosque is here, but underneath in this whole area, you can actually go into I can't, but there are rooms underneath here that you can get into. And remember last time I said you could see sort of the little vented thing that's in this picture as well. The niche they're talking about is up against the wall. But so I think last time on the video, I showed some of the gates were over here. This stairway going up, you can see it. Those are the southern steps. Here's another gate coming in that's kind of buried into the wall. So this is the eastern side where the Golden Gate is. This is the northern side where the sort of park is. This is the western side, all of this. And then the western wall, the Wailing Wall, is just this section down here. Because it's the only exposed portion of the Western Wall. But if you're in Jerusalem rather, most people go to this, but there's a lesser known other portion of the Western Wall that is around here, I think. You can get into it and visit it, and it's much less popular and much less populated. And it's like a little portion of the wall that people can go to. But I thought that was kind of a neat follow-up. Any questions on the temple before we move onward into Matthew?
That's great.
Okay. So on your own though, there's good stuff to look up on this. You can really find info. And the last little bit, for what it's worth, it's believed that the Dome of the Rock is built on the same spot where the temple was. Keeping in mind, you have the temple is built on a rock, and the Dome of the Rock, there is an exposed rock underneath. So the likelihood is pretty good that it's the same spot. However, you need to keep in mind that the Dome of the Rock was built hundreds of years later, after the temple had been destroyed and the Temple Mount had been left barren. So there was a big gap between the temple getting destroyed in 70 AD and the Dome of the Rock, which is built right in 690. So you have 600 years before the Dome of the Rock is built. And so, yeah, it's on the same spot, but it's some guesswork when you're dealing with 600 years, right? How much of this plaza had been taken up over the years, right? To take stones away. People do that sort of thing, right? So how much of it was repaired, it's unknown. But when the Muslims came and built the Dome of the Rock, again, keep in mind it's 600 years later, but it is thought to be the same spot. And logically, there wasn't a ton of rebuild. This is generally the design that it was. It was whether or not this whole thing was a plaza and some of it was a park, I don't know, but it's generally in the center of it. And so the idea is it's built on the same rock that the temple was built on. Thus,
what was confusing to me at the very beginning is they interchanged Temple Mount and Al-Aqsa Mosque. So I thought that was the same, two different words for the same building. And it wasn't until we got there and like, oh, there's a whole nother building, but it seems like they interchanged those terms for the Temple Mount.
Anyway,
I didn't buildings.
There's the Temple Mount. Muslims call it. Let me see if they call
Haram Asharif. Haram.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. What is it again? Say it again.
Haram Sharif.
Yeah, which means, do you remember what it means?
No.
What does it mean? I'll look it up. It means I wish I could remember all this. Haram
Sharif.
Yeah.
ASSHARIF.
There it is. It means Mount of the House. Yes, that means Mount of the House. So yeah, I should know these things, but I forget them over time. So yeah, that's it. The Temple Mount, the Mount of the House, the Holy Mount, whatever it is the whole space, right? I'm sorry, I keep running into these red things, but it's this whole space all the way around. And like if you can get cartoon maps of this that show what it looked like back in Jesus's time, and the place that we visited at the Israel Museum gives you that map as well, so you can see that. But there are buildings in it, and there are numerous buildings around the edges, right? Especially on the city side. But there's two enormous buildings there today. And yes, one is the Dome of the Rock, which is a shrine, and the other is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is a gigantic mosque. And in different ways, they are both the center of this as a Muslim holy place. But the mosque is over here, for what that's worth. Okay, all right, let's jump into Matthew. So all of that, the last class entirely was left on this one verse, so or two verses. So let's continue. Patrice, you got here first. Can you read Beginnings of Troubles?
Sounds like Ireland. Now, while Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately and said, "Tell us, when will these things happen? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" Jesus replied, "Watch out that no one deceives you. Many will come in my name saying, 'I'm the Christ.' They will deceive many people. You will hear about wars and reports of wars. Don't be alarmed. These things must happen, but this isn't the end yet. Nations and kingdoms will fight against each other, and there will be famines and earthquakes in all sorts of places. But all these things are just the beginning of the sufferings associated with the end. They will arrest you, abuse you, and they will kill you. All nations will hate you on account of my name. At that time, many will fall away. They will betray each other and hate each other. Many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because disobedience will expand, the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be delivered. This gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the world as a testimony to all the nations. Then the end will come."
Okay, so this is the first of a whole section, really. This chapter and the next chapter is the catalyst for this is they've been in the temple, and there is this question about that Jesus says, do you see all these things? And I assure you that no stone will be left on another stone. Everything will be demolished. The prediction of Jesus, by Jesus, that the temple will be destroyed is something that appears in all the Gospels in different ways. And in St. John's Gospel, it's up front. If you remember, the visit to the temple and the overthrowing of the tables happens in the second chapter rather than the end. But it's in all four Gospels. And it's also linked to the trial of Jesus, where part of what he's accused of is saying that the temple's going to get destroyed and that he's the Son of God and that sort of thing. And this section suddenly changes gears, and it looks for the rest of this chapter very much like a prophet would say. And if you ask, your modern day Bible scholars, they will say, well, it's unclear if this is the later church, right? St. Matthew's community that's writing about their own experiences and what has already happened to them, and giving a warning to other Christians that life ain't going to be all that easy as a Christian, or if this is actually what Jesus said. And I think probably it's a little bit of both, in that Jesus certainly seemed to be in the line of prophets, and this is not out of the norm for what he said, but it also probably is tweaked a little bit by each evangelist so that it is clearly being, examples of things that they had gone through. And what you get here is, this is the first of them. What you get is, what's it going to be like as we move forward as part of this community? And this line right here, the gospel of the kingdom, we run into all the time, right? Like parables of the kingdom, the gospel of the kingdom. And gospel means good news. And it's worth noting that he's talking about the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven. And from their viewpoint, the society that they knew was either like Herod the king or the Roman emperor, right? They knew a monarchy set up. And so one way to think about this is the good news of our new Christian society, right? If you think about it like that, is going to go all over the place. And what does our new Christian society look like? Well, it looks like a place where we're existing in a very, very messy world, where people are claiming that, they're the Messiah or they're the Christ, where wars are going on, and nations are fighting against each other, and famines and earthquakes happen and all this stuff. But you need, as my followers, Jesus is saying, to continue to press on throughout all of this. And so what's ahead of them is going to not be always all that easy. And if you think about it in terms of, if Matthew's gospel is probably written around 80-ish AD, right? Like 35 years after Jesus dies and rises, you've got the initial Christian community that has already experienced some of these things. And if you think of Christianity moving forward, it actually doesn't get better for quite some time until Constantine converts. They continue to go through this, and Christians around the world, depending on where you are, have continued to suffer in different ways up to our day. And so these passages often get read as a way for Christians to be like, well, now we're in this, but we need to get through this, rather than thinking this is the end. Does that make some sense? Any questions on this? We're going to get some more of this as we go through. All right. Who came on next? Sherry, you came on next. Can you read The Great Suffering? And I'll zoom it in. Sorry, I should have done that for Patrice. You got to unmute, though. You're still muted.
When you see the disgusting and destructive thing that Daniel talked about standing in the holy place, the reader should understand this. Then those in Judea must escape to the mountains. Those on the roof shouldn't come down to grab things from their houses. Those in the field shouldn't come back to grab their clothes. How terrible it will be at that time for women who are pregnant and for women who are nursing their children. Pray that it doesn't happen in winter or on the Sabbath day. There will be great suffering, such as the world has never before seen and will never again see. If that time weren't shortened, nobody would be rescued. But for the sake of the ones whom God chose, that time will be cut short. Then if somebody says to you, look, here's the Christ, or he's over there, over here, don't believe it. False Christs and false prophets will appear, and they will offer great signs and wonders in order to deceive, if possible, even those whom God has chosen. Look, I've told you ahead of time. So if they say to you, look, he's in the desert, don't go out. And if they say, look, he's in the rooms deep inside the house, don't believe it. Just as the lightning flashes from the east to the west, so it will be with the coming of the human one. The vultures gather wherever there's a dead body.
Okay. So this verse right here about the reference to Daniel is, you can go back into Daniel and there's this reference of the abomination that comes into the holy place. And in this context, and Daniel's context, it was a similar thing, but in this, actually the book of Daniel is a good example of this. The book of Daniel is written later than it claims to be, and that's pretty evident. They get some of the details of the time wrong. They put some of their own time, like I don't remember off the top of my head, but it's written, I think, a couple hundred years after when it claims to be, and it's written with a purpose for the people of the time when it's written to be able to look back and say, these things happened to this great figure Daniel, and now we're going through similar things, so have faith and continue. And this is brought forward here, and this line right here about the disgusting and destructive thing that Daniel talked about standing in the holy place, I think pretty much every scholar nowadays would tell you that this is a pretty clear reference to I think it was there was a statue of, the Romans came in and destroyed the temple and built on the spot a Roman temple, right? Like a pagan temple. And this is a reference to the disgusting and destructive thing that gets put into the holy place, right? And so all of this right here is when the temple gets destroyed. I don't know if anybody went to any of the stuff when we were in Israel, those of you that were, but there's lots of material that you can sort of dig into. There's this place called the Burned House, and you can watch videos of what it was like when the temple was destroyed. When we went to, did they show that stuff at Qumran? I can't remember when we went there. There was things like that they showed videos about what it was like when the temple was destroyed and how people fled into other areas. This looks very similar to that, to the time when the temple is destroyed, Jerusalem is destroyed, and everybody that's there runs away to the mountains, right? Like those in Judea must escape to the mountains and grab everything and just run and flee. So this looks like a very specific example of Jerusalem and the temple being destroyed. And Jesus is predicting it, but again, it becomes a little unclear if this is the exact prediction of Jesus or if the evangelist and the community are filling in some of those details to show the readers in their own time, right? You get this note, let the reader understand, or the reader should understand this, that the reader should understand what? The reader should understand this is when the Romans sacked the temple, right? So who's it written for is a big part of this. And a chunk of it is we've already gotten through some of this, but we're going to continue to have challenging times. So watch and continue to be prepared and don't get confused by false Christs, someone who says, you know, I'm the next Jesus, or I'm the true Messiah, or this or that. Don't get drift off of the way and that sort of thing. Because when Jesus comes again, the Son of Man, the human one is what they use here, it will be at a time that nobody's expecting. So anyway, any thoughts on that or questions about that? All right. More Son of Man stuff. I don't know who got on next. Sandra, can you unmute and read the coming of the human one section?
Now, immediately after the suffering of that time, the sun will become dark and the moon won't give its light. The stars will fall from the sky and the planets and other heavenly bodies will be shaken. Then the sign of the human one will appear in the sky. At that time, all the tribes of the earth will be full of sadness, and they will see the human one coming in the heavenly clouds with power and great splendor. He will send his angels with the sound of great trumpet, and they will gather his chosen ones from the four corners of the earth, from one end of the sky to the other.
Great. Okay. So this is in italics because this is a quote from Daniel. And we talked a little bit about this long ago, but this Bible uses the human one in sort of capital letters for the Greek and Hebrew phrase Son of Man. And Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man a number of times, and often in different ways. By the end of the gospel, the way he's using it most is following up on how it appears in the book of Daniel, which is in a really apocalyptic vision. In Daniel, I think it's chapter 7, but it might be 13. In Daniel, the Son of Man comes on the clouds at the end of time, bringing the apocalypse and sort of the new creation. And that's what this reference is. And in Daniel, it's at a time that is, you know, calculated far off into the future. But that phrase, Son of Man, is something that in the Hebrew scriptures sort of has, by the time it gets to Daniel, which is later, has really evolved. Early on in the Psalms and in other places, Son of Man is simply a euphemism for human being. Like, I'm a man, I'm a son of man, right? That sort of thing. And as it moves through the scriptures, it takes on a little bit more meaning. The book of Ezekiel has Son of Man dozens of times. Every time in our Bibles that Ezekiel is called mortal, right? If you ever read Ezekiel and you see mortal, 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 they're transliterating or not translating out Son of Man to mean mortal in that place. But in Ezekiel, excuse me, in Ezekiel, the title Son of Man has taken on a little bit higher quality, because now it's not just somebody who's a human being, it's a specific human Ezekiel who has a specific relationship as a prophet with God. And it continues to go up until you get to Daniel. And the Son of Man is now this heavenly human being figure flying in on the clouds at the end of time. Jesus takes on all of this. And it's in this context. Remember where we are too, right? Like, we're in Jerusalem. He is about to get handed over and crucified and died. So all of this, what's going to happen to the community after he dies and rises, what's that going to be like? And a chunk of that is there's going to be a period of time that is unknown how long, until Jesus returns in a form that's way beyond, you know, a prophet, but takes on what the prophets in Daniel were looking forward to at some future time. There is a whole cottage industry of people that have been trying to figure out when this is going to happen. And so every time there is, you know, solar eclipses or solar this or that, anything with the heavenly bodies and the planets and the stars and whatever, anything in terms of weird numbers, there's all sorts of people that that tell you that the world is going to end and Jesus is going to come back. And again and again and again, they seem to have failed to listen to this whole thing. If somebody says to you, look, it's happening right now, right? They're not going to get the right answer. And I actually know somebody who fell into this crowd. And it was interesting seeing how each time the date passed, right? We had like the Mayan end of the year, we had Y2K. And each time the date passed, it was like he just rebooted the clock and started again. And it was like, you've been wrong several times. No, but this is it. This is it. This is when it, and so it's an interesting.
So Matt, what struck me about these two chapters was the word "the chosen." So my sister-in-law has been, she wants me to watch this show called The Chosen. When I was growing up in Roman Catholic, I don't remember that being emphasized, but it's like they all want to be here, the last ones. They want to be the chosen, and all those other people are going to evaporate, but we're the chosen ones.
Right.
Is that what it all comes from? So
A lot of that comes from Revelation. It comes from, in the New Testament, there's three major sources of apocalyptic literature. The book of Revelation is one of them, the big one. The book of Revelation is heavily rooted in Daniel and in some other places in the Hebrew scriptures and Old Testament. The other ones are Jesus is another primary source. The different gospels, John has less of this, but Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have significant chunks of apocalyptic discourse things. And I think in Mark, there's one that's referred to as the little apocalypse. So it's like a whole chapter of this. And each gospel, other than John, has a fair amount of this. And then there's a little bit in Paul. I think it's Second Thessalonians has some end time stuff, and Paul talks a little bit about this too. The crowd that has mostly picked up on this and run with it tends to be evangelicals. And the interesting thing in the last 20, 30 years, and I think a lot of it is due to media, is the evangelicals, they produce a lot of movies. They produce a lot of audio video stuff. That Bible Project that we watched, the little, the comic book version, that's produced by sort of mainline, but they're still evangelicals. And one of the big things that they seem to be very interested in is this idea of being chosen and calculating the end times and that sort of thing. And it's crept in. I really think it's because of a lot of the media stuff, but it's crept into other denominations. It's crept into the Catholic Church. I'd be surprised if it's crept into the Orthodox Church, but it certainly has crept into some Episcopalian and other mainline Protestant stuff. Mostly, I think, because people watch something on the History Channel, or they watch the History Channel, or they watch one of these movies, and there really is such a focus on some of this stuff. There's this whole series of books called Left Behind.
Yes, and I read like the first and second one, but after everybody evaporated on the plane, I'm like, yeah, no, I don't need to do it. They just disappear. They just, and some people are left and some people are gone.
Yeah, I tend to, my view of this is, if somebody tells you, don't believe it. Like, that tends to be my take on this. We've had 2,000 years of people trying to claim that they knew exactly how this is going to work. And I think, honest to God, like, that misses the entire point of this. The point of this is there's a lot of crazy stuff that's going to happen, and it's going to get so weird sometimes that even followers of Jesus are going to be contributing to the craziness. Like, focus on what matters. And what matters is Jesus. And it'll be crystal clear when Jesus finally comes back. Don't worry about that. In the meantime, focus on Jesus. When we switch to the next chapter, you get, well, what does it look like to focus on Jesus? What does it look like to live in these times? And, this whole section ends with that great parable about the goats and the sheep, right? When you fed somebody, when you visited somebody in prison, when you gave somebody that was thirsty water, you did it to Jesus, right? And oddly enough, the people, I'm not throwing the evangelicals under the bus, but often the people that tend to be so focused on this stuff are less focused on servant ministry and your calling as a Christian to love your neighbor. They're far more focused on who's going to get saved or who's going to get chosen, and far less focused on day-to-day life, caring for people that are hungry or visiting people in prison or sheltering refugees. It's a huge disconnect for me when people are claiming to be Christians and so focused on this particular aspect, when, at least from my perspective, it's prefaced, right? If somebody says I know what's going on, don't believe it. Anyway, anything else on this? All right. Who's up next? Barbara, you're on my list going down. Can you unmute and read the lesson from the fig tree and day and hour? Do two chunks.
Learn this parable from the fig tree. After its branch becomes tender and it sprouts new leaves, you know that summer is near. In the same way, when you see all these things, you know that the human one is near at the door. I assure you that this generation won't pass away until all these things happen. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will certainly not pass away. But nobody knows when that day or hour will come, not the heavenly angels and not the Son. Only the Father knows. As it was in the time of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the human one. In those days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day Noah entered the ark. They didn't know what was happening until the flood came and swept them all away. The coming of the human one will be like that. At that time, there will be two men in the field. One will be taken and the other left. Two women will be grinding at the mill. One will be taken and the other left. Therefore, stay alert. You don't know what day the Lord is coming, but you understand that if the head of the house knew at what time the thief would come, he would keep alert and wouldn't allow the thief to break into his house. Therefore, you also should be prepared, because the human one will come at a time you don't know.
Great. Okay. This gives you both sides of this, right? It continually reminds that you don't know when the day of the Lord is coming. You don't know the time, right? Nobody knows the day or the hour. But this part, it's like, look, you know how to read a fig tree and how it works. At some point, it'll be obvious, and then there it is, right? But until that happens, we don't know. Now, it is also worth noting that the early church was many of the early church was definitely in the category that they thought, oh, okay, this is going to happen while we're all still alive, right? And there's that line at the end of St. John's Gospel where it seems to say that you're going to, I can't remember exactly what it is, but where Jesus is talking to John, the beloved disciple, to Peter on the beach, and says, you're going to suffer and be bound and crucified. He is going to see me again in a different way, or something like that. And there was an early church view that Jesus was going to come back. And I think it was a little jarring that it didn't happen immediately. And it just kept going and going and going. And what the church did was it said, well, I assure you that this generation won't pass away until these things happen. What they did was they started looking and saying, what Jesus was predicting is going on. We just haven't gotten to the point where the second coming is there. Maybe it'll be down the line at some point. And they began to focus more on, well, what really was he talking about? What is this supposed to be? And it's stay alert, right? You don't know what the day is, but you understand that if the head of the house knew when the thief would come, again, you don't know, but you do know that there is a thief coming, so to speak. What would you do? You would keep alert. and you wouldn't allow the thief to break into the house. So I think what that means is in this time, whether it's 30 years after Jesus or 2,000 years after Jesus or 3,000 years after this, what do you do with the time that you have? You use it and follow Jesus and focus on Jesus and live your life as a Christian, as if, and one way to think about this, as if at any minute, the second coming could be true in your life. Like you could drop dead or get hit by a bus and bang, you meet Jesus, right? That's often how it's viewed. And there's a great bumper sticker that you may have seen, right? Jesus is coming, ... Do you know what it says afterwards? Look busy, right? So I've actually seen one that scared me when I was driving. It was something about drive too close to me and we'll both meet Jesus together or something like that. And it was like, yikes. So, people are, what does the second coming mean is a great question to grapple with. And when I was in seminary, I was at an evangelical Episcopal church. It was bilingual, English and Spanish. And the rector there, he asked me once, what is your favorite theological image? And some other day, I'll tell you what I said. But what he said, because I said, well, what's yours? And he said, the second coming. And I was like, the second coming? Like, you really are an evangelical. Like, all you're worried about is the future. He said, no. I view it as I could meet Jesus, like he could come right now, or I could get hit by a bus. And so every second of my life should be lived watching and waiting and trying to live out my faith, because you do not know the hour or time that you might meet Christ again. And I thought that's not a bad way of thinking about the second coming. So I pass that on to you. Anything on this? All right. James, can you read faithful and unfaithful servants?
Faithful and unfaithful servants. Who then are the faithful and wise servants whom their master puts in charge of giving food at the right time to those who live in his house? Happy are those servants whom the master finds fulfilling their responsibilities when he comes. I assure you that he will put them in charge of all his possessions. But suppose those bad servants should say to themselves, my master won't come until later. And suppose they begin to beat their fellow servants and to eat and drink with the drunks. The master of those servants will come on a day when they are not expecting him, at a time they couldn't predict. He will cut them in pieces and put them in a place with the hypocrites. People there will be weeping and grinding their teeth.
Great. Okay. So now we're sort of back into parables again, and you get, I think, a pretty clear image of what do you do in the meantime? The master is away and he's going to come back at some other point. So what do? Do you do what you're supposed to do, which is live a Christian life, as spelled out in the Sermon on the Mount and other places? Or do you, in this case, it gives, do you fight with each other and party constantly and this and that? I would add, or do you focus endlessly on when he's going to come back and not worry about what you're supposed to be doing, right? Like you get that in that other parable. I think it might be in the next chapter, where you get the three different servants with the talents, right? And one invests, and another invests not as well, but still does invest. And the third one buries it in the ground because he's worried about when the master is going to come back, and he doesn't want to, run any risks or do anything. So he's not being responsible, right? It's another example of this. Anything on this parable? All right. You want to keep going or not? It's quarter of 17 of. We can go another parable, maybe. You want to read a tiny bit more? Anybody have to run away? All right. So this chapter is three very well-known parables. I don't know if we'll get through all of it in a couple of minutes, but we can certainly read the first one. JD, you haven't read. Do you want to read the parable of the 10 young bridesmaids?
At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 young bridesmaids who took their lamps and went out to meet the groom. Now 5 of them were wise, and the other 5 were foolish. The foolish ones took their lamps, but didn't bring oil for them. But the wise ones took their lamps and also brought containers of oil. When the groom was late in coming, they all became drowsy and went to sleep. But at midnight there was a cry, "Look, the groom! Come out to meet him." Then all those bridesmaids got up and prepared their lamps. But the foolish bridesmaids said to the wise ones, "Give us some of your oil, because our lamps have gone out." But the wise bridesmaids replied, "No, because if we share with you, there won't be enough for our lamps and yours. We have a better idea. You go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves." But while they were gone to buy oil, the groom came. Those who were ready went with him into the wedding. Then the door was shut. Later, the other bridesmaids came and said, "Lord, Lord, open the door for us." But he replied, "I tell you the truth, I don't know you. Therefore, keep alert, because you don't know the day or the hour."
Again, another parable, I think, pretty straightforward. The lesson of this is not to not share your oil. Right? The lesson is that you're supposed to be prepared, because and there is some personal responsibility in being prepared, because when it happens, if you may end up in a situation where nobody else can kind of help you, kind of thing. So be prepared, take your own responsibility, stay on the course, follow Jesus, live your life as if every second matters, and what have you. Any questions on this? All right, comments? Okay. The parable of the valuable coins. I just talked about this. Patrice, do you want to read this?
Sure. I don't believe that God wouldn't open the door for the next slide.
Well, that's it's a parable. It's a
That's what I believe. My God will open those doors eventually for those other 5 people. He'll let everybody in.
well, there's other parables that can probably follow up with that. So go for it.
All right, here we go. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who was leaving on a trip. He called his servants and handed his possessions over to them. To one he gave 5 valuable coins, and to another he gave 2, and to another he gave 1. He gave to each servant according to that servant's ability. Then he left on his journey. After the man left, the servant who had 5 valuable coins took them and went to work doing business with them. He gained 5 more. In the same way, the one who had 2 valuable coins gained 2 more. But the servant who had received the 1 valuable coin dug a hole in the ground and buried his master's money. Now, after a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The one who had received 5 valuable coins came forward with 5 additional coins. He said, "Master, you gave me 5 valuable coins. Look, I've gained 5 more." His master replied, "Excellent. You are a good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little. I'll put you in charge of much. Come, celebrate with me." The second servant also came forward and said, "Master, you gave me 2 valuable coins. Look, I've gained 2 more." His master replied, "Well done. You are a good and faithful servant. You've been faithful over a little. I'll put you in charge of much. Come, celebrate with me." Now the one who had received 1 valuable coin came and said, "Master, I knew that you were a hard man. You harvest grain where you haven't sown. You gather crops where you haven't spread seed. So I was afraid, and I hid my valuable coin in the ground. Here, you have what's yours." His master replied, "You evil and lazy servant. You knew that I harvest grain where I haven't sown, and that I gather crops where I haven't spread seed. In that case, you should have turned my money over to the bankers, so that when I returned, you could give me what belonged to me with interest. Therefore, take from him the valuable coin and give it to the one who has 10 coins. Those who have much will receive more, and they will have more than they need. But as for those who don't have much, even the little bit they have will be taken away from them. Now, take the worthless servant and throw him out into the farthest darkness. People will be weeping and grinding their teeth."
Great.
All right.
Okay. I would say, based on the comment you made before, don't build your whole theology off of one parable. Like, yeah, you know,
Okay.
like
All right.
parables tend to be, in this case, they tend to, you know, you can go in a lot of different directions, but every time we've run into parables in Matthew's gospel, the placement of them tends to sort of focus you usually on one, sometimes two things. And these are sort of back to back to back. And it's kind of like, what do you do with the time that you have, right? Do you use it wisely or not? And the real world examples that are given do certainly give an over the top, harsh bridegroom or master or whatever, right? Or king at the wedding feast, like everybody's being executed left and right and this and that. That can be easy to get lost in that and view God as the one that's throwing everybody into the outer darkness, but it's a parable. It's not necessarily meant to say, okay, this is God and this is you and this is this. It's a parable that illustrates with a real world example what happens when people are responsible or irresponsible. What happens when people use their time wisely or when they're not, right? And so it gives a real world example. And I'm not sure how over the top some of these images of the king are in Jesus's day, right? Like Matthew's gospel starts off with an evil king, Herod. And so it's, you know, use your time wisely and be responsible, I think, is the message here. Less and you know, less than how does the rich man act in this parable? The rich man doesn't act very well in this parable, right? The rich man is not merciful. The rich man is overbearing. The rich man sometimes acts strangely in this. The king sometimes acts strangely. So I'm not sure how helpful it is to illustrate and identify God every single time with these, for what that's worth. So any comments on this parable? There's a version of this in Luke with different amounts of money. You've heard probably a million different times. You probably know these as talents, right? The Roman coin was a talent. It was worth like a year's wage or something, or $1 million or something, maybe more than like 5 years' wage or 10 years' wage. And so it's, you know, a crazy amount of money. Whenever people end up preaching on this, it's always out of context, and often it gets lost that perhaps the core message that's trying to be presented by the evangelist is simply, this is what it looks like when some people are responsible in the real world. Try to be responsible in your own faith life. All right. The last one, probably the most famous parable in Matthew, and then we'll finish the chapter. Who's up? Sherry, are you up? I'm not sure if you're up. All right, it's the judgment of the nations.
Now, when the human one comes in his majesty and all his angels are with him, he will sit on his majestic throne. All the nations will be gathered in front of him. He will separate them from each other, just as shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right side, but the goats he will put on his left. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, who will receive good things from my Father? Inherit the kingdom that was prepared for you before the world began. I was hungry and you gave me food to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me a drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothes to wear. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me." Then those who are righteous will reply to him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you a drink? When did we see you as a stranger and welcome you, or naked and give you clothes to wear? When did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?" Then the king will reply to them, "I assure you that when you have done it for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you have done it for me." Then he will say to those on his left, "Get away from me, you who will receive terrible things. Go into the unending fire that has been prepared for the devil and his angels. I was hungry and you didn't give me food to eat. I was thirsty and you didn't give me anything to drink. I was a stranger and you didn't welcome me. I was naked and you didn't give me clothes to wear. I was sick and in prison and you didn't visit me." Then they will reply, "Lord, When did we see you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and didn't do anything to help you? Then he will answer, I assure you that when you haven't done it for one of the least of these, you haven't done it for me. And then they will go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous ones will go into eternal life.
Great. Okay. This one, you cannot escape the fact that it starts with, now when the Son of Man comes in his majesty, he will sit on his majestic throne. And it's less a parable than a prediction, right? And so, it's just as. So it is equated to the Son of Man. And if anybody ever asks you, where's hell in the Bible? Well, it's right here, right? And right here. So and where's heaven in the Bible, right? Eternal life and eternal punishment. So it's hard to escape that. It is in the context of what does it look like to be a responsible follower of Jesus. And it is interesting. All the nations are gathered. This parable could be about everybody, but it also could be about the Christians and how they live. It could be about everybody, but it gives you a stark example of what it looks like to be a quote unquote good person and what it looks like to be a quote unquote bad person. And it comes down to ministering to different people, strangers, the naked, the hungry, prisoners, etc., the sick, or not. So Patrice, if you're looking for a verse that that gives you hell, here it is, right? So figuratively and literally, but the reality is you can't, if people are like, well, Jesus never talked about hell or anything like that. I'm not sure that people have read this parable. This is pretty stark. Most of the time, certainly when I'm preaching on it, the focus is on how to live your life and what it looks like and minister to everybody as if they were Jesus. But it is hard to grapple with and escape this end of it, especially, get away from me, you who will receive terrible things. Go into the unending fire that's been prepared for the devil and his angels. It's also interesting that there's a couple of shifts here, though, right? The king, there's a shift somewhere in here, right? Did you notice that? The Son of Man sits on a throne, but the Son of Man becomes a king. So I'm not sure what to make of that, but it doesn't continue with the Son of Man throughout. It continues with a king. And the harsh king language that we've had in most of the other parables that feature a king comes right back when you get the king. So maybe you are meant to go back to those other parables and be like, maybe there is something scary to think about here. I leave it at that. I don't have an answer. If you want to read a book about that is mentioned every time Anglicans or Episcopalians talk about hell, read C.S. Lewis's The Great Divorce. That's a great version of how to wrap your head around some of these things. Now I'm in the club of, having mentioned a C.S. Lewis book when hell comes up, but it's a good read and you could probably read it this afternoon if you wanted to. Anything on this? Any comments, anything like that? All right. Okay. Well, we flew through chapter 25. Next week, we start with chapter 26 and we jump into the plot to kill Jesus and Judas and the Passover and Last Supper. So this is our final section. St. Matthew's Gospel has 28 chapters, so we have 3 left. Our Yale professors do have a video on this, so we'll watch that probably next week and go from there. I'm going to stop recording, but I have a question after I stop recording. Nothing secret. It has to do with if anybody wants to get Thai food for lunch, and I think our audience online doesn't need to hear that. So